So the other day, a friend of mine wondered what I thought about the parable of the persistent widow in Luke 18. So I went and read the story, and I got to wondering what the stories around that parable might have to lend to the discussion. And I realized that this whole chunk of stories, they're all connected, I think, in some intricate patterns. So we start off with the story of 10 lepers who are cleansed. Then we have Jesus giving a whole bunch of confusing teachings about the coming of the kingdom. Then we've got the parable of the persistent widow, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, the little children coming to Jesus, the story of the rich ruler in the kingdom of heaven. Then Jesus predicts his death and resurrection. Then we've got the story of a blind beggar healed. We've got Zacchaeus after that. And then finally, a parable of 10 servants. And maybe that just sounds like a bunch of random stories, but check this out. Okay, the whole section starts with it saying, on his way to Jerusalem, ... and ends with, after telling the story, Jesus went on toward Jerusalem. So it's like this whole section is travel stories almost. And the collection of stories also starts with a story of 10 men where only one of the 10 responds correctly, and it ends with a story of 10 men where one of them responds incorrectly. And then if we move one step inward, we've got the end and start of those two respective stories. We've got people asking Jesus, when will this kingdom come? And I think that question is what all of this whole little group of stories is about, because Jesus answers that question with saying, actually, we should be wondering not when will the kingdom come, but who will enter the kingdom. So there are a couple different ways of organizing these stories. The first way is in groups of two. We've got two parables about prayer, the parable of the persistent widow and the parable of the Pharisee and tax collector. The first of these is about a widow who prays for justice and receives mercy. The second of these is about a tax collector who prays for mercy, and it says he went home justified. Next, we've got two stories about entering the kingdom. The first one says that it's hard to enter the kingdom if you're not willing to become childlike. And the second one says it's hard to enter the kingdom if you are rich. Then we've got two encounters with two men of Jericho, both of whom have trouble seeing Jesus, one because he's blind and the other because he's short. And we also have a set of stories where Jesus is predicting things, but those are a little confusing, so I'll gloss over those at the moment, and let's focus on these three sets of two. So the first set of two, we've got a most likely poor widow and a rich tax collector. Then we've got children, again, most likely poor, and then a rich ruler. And with the last set, we have a blind man who we're told is a beggar, again, poor, and a rich tax collector. So we're starting to see some themes of rich and poor, weak and powerful coming out in the way that these stories are pitted against each other. So that's one way to look at these 10 stories, because there's 10 of them, yeah. Another way is if we kind of group the first 7 stories off on their own and look at them by themselves, we'll notice that the first story and the last story both have characters saying, have mercy on me, and Jesus responding with, your faith has made you well. And the center story also has a character saying, have mercy on me. So that should clue us in to be on the lookout for some sort of chiastic pattern, which might become more apparent if we ask ourselves the question, who is the main character for each story? Jesus identifies the leper in the first story as a foreigner. The next story starts with some Pharisees asking a question. Then we've got a widow, then a Pharisee, then children. The next story is about a rich ruler whose beliefs seem to point to a Pharisaical worldview. And finally, a disabled man. So maybe you noticed it. We've got 4 representatives of those who are at the bottom of society, the most vulnerable: foreigners, widows, children, and the disabled. And then interspersed between them, we've got those at the top, the Pharisees. Well, maybe not at the top, but they're doing all right. They're the ones who we would expect to be in the kingdom. But spoiler alert, Jesus is going to flip that all upside down. And whenever we have a pattern like this, we want to zoom in on the center and see if there's anything unusual about it. I said that the center one here, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, I said the main character was the Pharisee for the sake of the pattern, but obviously it has 2 main characters. We could look at it and say that the main character is the tax collector, but didn't Jesus say that rich people are going to struggle to get into heaven? Well, that's where we get this really cool story of Zacchaeus that concludes the other 7. Now, this tax collector is interesting because in a lot of ways, he kind of looks like those at the bottom of society. Like I said before, he struggles to see Jesus, just like the blind man. There's this weird line at the end of the story that implies that Zacchaeus was treated like a foreigner, even though he was actually a Jew. And most interesting of all, he is climbing a tree. Now, what demographic are you most likely to expect seeing climbing trees? Yes, children. So, look at this. We've got this rich man who is acting like a child. Now, what does Jesus say? It is really hard to enter the kingdom unless you are willing to act like a child. Isn't that so cool? I love the ways that Jesus keeps inverting the norms. As soon as you think you might understand what he's saying, he turns it all inside out. Good stuff. I would encourage you to go read through these chapters with all of that in mind and see if you can find any other interesting little tidbits, messages, patterns. There's more in there. Let me know what you think.